The 19th century Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard actually once wrote in his journal entry, this thought experiment: what if one day someone were to invent an instrument, a talking tube as he called it, and they could essentially communicate and reach everyone of the land? What would happen? Now, who would have known that what he wrote is actually incredibly prophetic? He had some sort of a prescience, because here I am tonight talking to you through such a tube. And of course, there are many other such tubes aside from YouTube, also social media of all forms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and all that. But again, it's so interesting that Kierkegaard more or less was pondering about this exact question, and in his philosophical contemplations and assessment of it, he was actually quite concerned with what this would mean if one day such a talking tube were to exist. Then it could be a philosophically challenging thing. In formulating his own philosophy, Kierkegaard did not have social media or really the internet, but he was able to really draw references from advertised media at the time, the newspaper and the press. And so he formulated a very interesting philosophy that I think it is incredibly relevant today and does raise a lot of implications of what it means to live in an age of social media. The first is really the idea of the disproportion of communication. According to Kierkegaard, we were never really designed to communicate beyond a certain amount of people. Humans, at least how we were designed, if you were to look at it from a biological standpoint, we're only really able to communicate, at least by our own biological instruments, between each other and perhaps even really a small group. If you were to look at it from the standpoint of anthropology, same thing. We used to live in tribes, at least very small communities, and we could only communicate with a certain amount of people. There was a limit of how we could communicate. But of course, that is not so much true today with social media. We can essentially reach millions of people around the world, theoretically even billions. Indeed, today, if you were to look at the development of media, there has been a shift from communication led by a few in broadcasting to literally a democratization of communication, where technically the many to the many, we could essentially reach a lot of people with all these platforms. If we were to put out a certain tweet, a certain video, we all of a sudden have these platforms where we can reach so many people, a very disproportionate amount towards what we were really designed to be able to. Now, the philosophical problem with communication, at least according to Kierkegaard, in the disproportion of communication, is that as communication is able to be reached disproportionately, then a lot of confusion and insanity could potentially result. The message that is actually being communicated as it is reached towards more and more people can easily be blown out of proportion and even removed from context, creating confusion of all kinds. My own interpretation of that is this idea that, imagine if we were having a conversation today, just me and you. Well, of course, hopefully it is a very articulate conversation and you understand what I'm saying, but imagine if somehow millions and millions of people all of a sudden are able to receive this message in line. And of course, when that is happening, the personal context is entirely removed, and they are now interpreting what I'm saying based on their own contextual information. And of course, that can lead to all sorts of confusion. We can easily see this in YouTube, where we see a lot of viral videos where all of a sudden, after it's become very viral, there are hundreds of thousands of comments, and yet a lot of the comments, they could be totally off tangent or all over the spectrum, as people take different sort of messages from the communication. And that is the sort of disproportion of communication that Kierkegaard is essentially talking about. Like a Chinese whisper gone wrong. When you are able to have so many people participate in that communication, that happens. The second philosophical implication is really this idea of leveling that Kierkegaard talks about. Essentially this idea that today, if you were on the internet, you would be able to find maybe a really well-researched paper on, let's say, biology by a leading biologist from maybe, I don't know, Cambridge University or Harvard, and he's got this thing up there and you can read it and it's great. He spent 20 years of his time researching that. And at the same time, right next to it, potentially maybe on the second Google search, you could also find an entry written by some amateur person, maybe in his basement somewhere, with no understanding of biology, writing about biology in his own warped understanding or philosophy of it. And it is quite incredible that technically both pieces of information are leveled in the same sort of playing field, at least in the internet, in this mass media sort of context. And this leveling is really quite an interesting thing that you see with the democratization of media today, that essentially you can find all sorts of information, yet they're all leveled the same on the internet. And this really does present a very, very big issue, a big challenge to our accumulation of knowledge and also really the development of our rationality. Information today is all over the place, and there are a lot of information that are really not of the same caliber as one another, yet they are all positioned in the same place, almost in the same way. And those who are not discerning, which is really a lot of people, they would not be able to tell the difference between what is actually considered good information in terms of its accuracy and also information that is totally misinformed. And that is a lot of the dangers that we see today with the rise of, as I say, so-called fake news. That, I suppose, is one of the dangers and the caution of how liberating media has become, that now we have access to these little tubes all over the internet. Technically anyone can potentially put any sort of view out there and people can potentially find it just as easily. And thirdly, Kierkegaard actually predicted that if we were to have such instruments as social media today, it would give rise to the creation of what he called the public. Now that sounds like a very weird word, but let me explain. So in his thought experiment, and also his understanding of media, there really is a rise of anonymity. The idea that technically anyone could anonymously write and maybe broadcast information. And that is a challenge because as this is proliferate furthermore, eventually it would create a public, essentially an abstract entity of people online that we have no idea who they are. And this public, this collective of anonymous people is an abstraction. They are technically everybody, but they are also nobody at the same time. There is no agency in terms of the information that is actually being produced online and also perpetuated online. In other words, if today we are not putting our name to our communication and therefore anonymous, there is in a sense no accountability, then essentially anything could potentially be perpetuated because we don't have to be accounted for what we are perpetuating. And that could be a serious issue, especially in certain social media that we see today. That is a very big issue. But the creation of the public is much more than just the production of the information, but also the perpetuation of it. The idea that if you were to, let's say, go on YouTube and you look at each video, you see hundreds of thousands of views or any amount of views, and that represents a public, an abstraction. We have no idea who these viewers are, but yet they have so much sway with what information is actually being produced, yet the information we have of them is practically nothing. We have no idea who they are. They're not accountable for what should be watched, what should be considered good information, and what should be considered information that should be perpetuated. And that is the issue. Something like, for example, a video clip, let's say a meme that might have very, very little value or maybe even offensive could have hundreds of millions of views and get perpetuated by the algorithm or maybe become socially acceptable because so many people are watching it. Yet again, the acceptance of it and its perpetuation is from this public, this abstract entity of people that we have no idea who they are. Communication has evolved to such an extent with these instruments that technically we have created an abstract entity that is now the judge and the facilitator of information everywhere. And we have to bear in mind that this entity is abstract. It is essentially nothing and everything at the same time. And certainly if you were to consider your own endeavors in YouTube, especially if you were journeying across YouTube maybe in the late at night, sometimes you get recommended these videos that have millions of views, and yet after watching it, you're just baffled what you just watched. Again, it might be something that is totally terrible in some sense, yet at the same time, today it's broadcasted to you and perpetuated everywhere. And that is, of course, talking about the terrible ones. What about offensive ones? What about things that are maybe very aggravating or maybe immoral on some standard, yet it is perpetuated? Just because it's received the approval of the public does not equate to the fact that it truly is information that is worth perpetuating, at least by a human standard of values and maybe even morals. And that is the idea here that is being put forth by Kierkegaard. So as we can see, considering all these things I've just mentioned, Kierkegaard is very apprehensive of this little tube, this instrument, if it were to exist, because he was already quite apprehensive with media of his time. So if he were alive today to see social media, to see YouTube, he would be shocked, absolutely shocked. And he would also offer a lot, and he would be highly critical of it for these reasons I've just mentioned. And these are very interesting philosophical takeaways that we can keep in mind, because again, today we are thrown into the midst of information today. We live in an age where the informational landscape is just totally chaotic and everywhere. And we have to develop a sense of criticality to be able to navigate this landscape, to understand these things I've just mentioned, so that we are able to truly consume information in a way that can actually help us develop. And aside from that, I think it's also really important for us to understand that since we live in this democratic age of information where we are all the creators of information in our own right, there's one thing that's really important, I think, that goes away with the rise of social media, and that's the idea of agency. It's really important to have agency in how you actually create information online. It's important to not just ignorantly or blindly, let's say, perpetuate and pass certain information, just share without really thinking about it. There's an importance to have the criticality I've talked about, because you are also an agent of this information, and at the same time to be accountable with the sort of information that you are sharing, such that we're contributing more to human rationality and knowledge rather than the opposites of that. And I think that is so important in today's age.